rules on both sides. However, the sinking of the liner Laconia in September 1942 prompted Dönitz to change the rules concerning aid to survivors. U-boats were not put at risk. The Laconia had been carrying Italian prisoners of war, and a number of U-boats came under attack from Allied aircraft when they were trying to assist the survivors. Following this, Dönitz ordered his commanders not to render assistance and not to pick up survivors except when they could be of use to the submarine or to Germany. U-boat captains were, in his words, to be severe. Remember, he continued, that in his bombing raids on German cities, the enemy has no regard for women and children. This position was in clear breach of the London Protocol of 1936 and led to Dönitz being charged with war crimes. At Nuremberg, the prosecution said that this meant in practice an order to kill survivors. Dönitz argued that putting the safety of the submarine first was the main responsibility of the commanding officer. One of the witnesses for the defense was the Commander-in-Chief of the US Pacific Fleet, Admiral Chester Nimitz. Nimitz told the tribunal that American submarines in the Pacific had virtually the same orders as Dönitz had issued. Dönitz was convicted on a much lesser charge and sentenced to 10 years imprisonment. He died in 1980. On the outbreak of war, the Royal Navy had few ships capable of escorting convoys. The fleet was based upon some 20 major warships deployed around the world, policing the British Empire and the trade routes which maintained that empire. The resources which had gone into developing dedicated, purpose-built anti-submarine escorts for use in the North Atlantic were largely confined to giving destroyers and sloops a rudimentary fit of basic underwater submarine detection equipment and a few depth charge racks. Surface ships could detect submarines underwater by using two methods. Firstly, hydrophones lowered under the water might hear the noises made by U-boats' engines or propellers, but the submarine had to be very close for this to be effective. Today this is known as passive sonar. Ships were able to detect submarines using crude hydrophones as early as 1918. The more advanced method was to mount an ASDIC transmitter on the bottom of the ship. ASDIC stood for Anti-Submarine Detection Investigation Committee, named after a group who looked into the problem in the 1930s. The ASDIC sent out a wave of sound which would rebound off the hull of a submarine. The transmitter then became a receiver which listened for the returning sound wave, or echo. This is known today as active sonar. In 1939, the effective ASDIC range was about a mile. By the end of the war, better ASDIC sets were finding submarines well beyond this range. The sinking of the Athenia and other vulnerable merchant ships in the early days of the war caused the Admiralty to examine its position. Even then, the Royal Navy was more concerned about the threat from Germany's few surface ships than it was of submarines, and important convoys were often allocated an old battleship to scare off the Germans. When the convoy system was introduced, its escort might consist of a couple of old First World War destroyers for the last few hundred miles into a British port. Further west than 12 degrees, the convoy would be lucky to have any escort at all, and even if it did, the protection offered by a converted merchant ship with a few old 6-inch guns was minimal. Gradually, efforts were made to address the situation. Existing destroyers and sloops were given an enhanced anti-submarine capability. More suitable merchant ships, particularly large trawlers, were converted to ASW vessels and deployed on coastal work. Following agreements between the United States and Great Britain, 40 obsolete American destroyers were transferred to the Royal Navy, given a quick conversion, and deployed as escorts under the White Ensign. The main task, however, was to find a type of warship dedicated to anti-submarine operations that was cheap, quick, and easy to build in small shipyards, and needed only a small crew to operate it. The answer was in Middlesbrough. Smith's Dock Limited had come up with the idea of such an escort vessel based on their whale catcher Southern Pride. The design was to be a little larger than the whaler, but still small at only just over 1,000 tons. It would need a crew of about 100, had a steam reciprocating engine driving one propeller, which would give it a speed of 16 knots. It carried one 4-inch gun, plus a few smaller anti-aircraft guns, but it had a good ASDIC set and could carry up to 70 depth charges. The Flower-class corvettes, as they became known, were hideous vessels to serve in due to their dreadful seakeeping qualities, but they were ideal for the situation and became immortalized as the fictional corvette Compass Rose in the book and film The Cruel Sea. The Flower class and their successors, the Castles, plugged the gap until something better came along. Once America had joined the war and her massive production capability was working, the Americans lent Britain a number of their destroyer escorts, smaller versions of their destroyers, but better for convoy escort. Britain built her own equivalent, the Hunt class. More importantly, in Britain, the corvette concept was enlarged, given better engines with 2 propellers, increasing the speed to 21 knots, a heavier armament, and a depth charge capacity of 150. Thus, the modern frigate was born. Even so, corvette construction still kept the smaller shipyards busy until the end of the war. Large trawlers and minesweepers were also built, which had a secondary anti-submarine escort role, and older destroyers were converted to escorts as new classes of modern destroyers entered the fleet. By 1942, it was apparent to British and American commanders that the key to success in the Battle of the Atlantic was the aircraft. German U-boats were potent weapons, but they were vulnerable to surprise air attack, either when they were shadowing a convoy or when they were on passage to or from their bases in western France. This became even more crucial when aircraft were equipped with radars that could identify a target many miles away, and when the target could be physically illuminated at night with the use of the Lee light. This was a large searchlight mounted under an aircraft, which could be switched on at the start of an attack. Not only did it give the attacker a better sight of the submarine, it also blinded the crew of the U-boat in the vital moments before they could respond. But the problem was always range. The Atlantic was a huge battlefield. An aircraft of this period did not have the endurance to cover it all. The air gap between Newfoundland, Iceland and the west coast of Britain was always important, and the closing of the gap with aircraft was pivotal to the outcome of the battle. So an urgent priority was given to the acquisition of suitable aircraft. These could either be deployed from ships within the convoy or from strategically located land bases. It was to this end that the Allies occupied Iceland, Greenland and the Faroes, but other bases which could have been useful, like the Azores or Ireland, were denied because of their owners' neutrality. Once the bases were found, then suitable aircraft had to be selected. Britain had considerable pre-war experience of the flying boat, and their versatility was useful especially in the early stages of the battle. The short Sunderland and the consolidated Catalina proved especially effective.
Night and day, the Sunderland flying boats patrol far out to eastward, keeping the German coast under constant surveillance for any sign of unwanted activity.
But the ideal long-range maritime patrol aircraft would have to be based on a bomber design. And such aircraft were hard to find, especially as RAF Bomber Command and the US Air Force jealously guarded the aircraft they had. The constant demands of Air Marshal Sir Arthur Harris for his strategic bombing campaign over Germany were such that coastal command of the RAF had to be satisfied with those bombers such as the Wellington, whose bombing role had been taken over by the Avro Lancaster. One aircraft, however, was to have a huge impact on this aspect of the campaign. The consolidated B-24 Liberator had a range of over 2,500 miles, and with long-range fuel tanks added, it could remain airborne for up to 18 hours. It was useful as a bomber, which led to a tug-of-war between bomber and coastal commands once the latter appreciated its potential in the war against the U-boat. Those aircraft which were allocated to coastal command soon proved their worth, as they enabled shore-based air cover to be maintained almost all the way across the North Atlantic. To enable some sort of air cover to be maintained out of range of land-based aircraft, the Allies had to rely on aircraft carried by ships. As fleet aircraft carriers were in short supply and were often needed elsewhere, alternative and cheaper ways of providing that